Despite me hosting a channel that focuses on digital imaging, my favorite form of photography is still analog. I have 12 film cameras, which I mostly use, and a fridge full of film to the frustration of my family. There are a host of reasons why I prefer the film experience, and it has little to do with the final image. I also like film because it's not my only choice. Thus, when I choose to shoot film, I do it with purpose. One of the things that I applaud Fujifilm for is their efforts to get you as close to the filmic experience while maintaining all the benefits of digital. It's in their simple dial-based design, or something like the actual glass viewfinder of the X Pro line. But today, we're talking about their film simulations. Before we jump in, I want to say that there are, as expected, a few good videos on this topic already. And what I hope to do in this video is to take things to a deeper tutorial level. I want to teach you a bit about the science of film simulation and matching to a particular look or feel. I don't think that this is even really just a Fujifilm thing, as many cameras like Sony for one give you the options to create custom looks. However, there's one thing that I can confidently say that Fujifilm can do better than any other camera brand, and that is film simulations. The reason for this is also the same reason why they are lagging behind video features compared to the likes of, say, Sony, Panasonic, or Canon. It's their business legacy. In my X-H2S review, I mentioned the reason that Fujifilm doesn't have abundant video features is because, well, they've never really been in the video camera business, whereas Sony, Panasonic, and Canon have all paid for the R&D into the video decades ago. The same can be said for Fujifilm when talking about film simulations. They've been making film since 1934 and have been really a global film powerhouse ever since.
Here comes Fujifilm with color pictures so true to life. It's a real breakthrough. Fuji HR Films. Fuji's advanced technology has developed ultra-thin color layers unlike any other film in the world.
This is to say that the scientists and engineers at Fujifilm know film science better than anyone, and particularly how to translate that into a digital space by leveraging data that really no other current camera maker has been able to work with. There's a fantastic in-depth article online written by Dave Etchells of imagingresource.com that I will quote often in this video, and which I've included a link to in the description below. As an additional fun fact, Fujifilm has not only been making cameras since the 1940s, but are often attributed to having the very first digital camera with the Fuji X DS1P in 1988. Okay, so why shoot film simulation JPEGs on Fujifilm cameras and just not shoot RAW and then edit them to look like the film after? Well, there are several reasons for this. First being accuracy. As I mentioned, Fujifilm knows the secret sauce each film curve, so they can apply that at a very, very deep level. It would be nearly impossible to do this in Photoshop, or at the very least, it would take you an immense and unrealistic amount of time. The second is speed. Let's say you're traveling or a photojournalist, or really any other reason that you don't have time to grade the raw photos. Well, then this is, quite honestly, the best way to get a beautifully textured image with zero editing time. This is one of my actual favorite uses of the simulations, which when I'm traveling, I like to just shoot the photo, I can immediately send it to my phone and post to social. The third is, if you want to get as close to the filmic experience, so to say, without committing time and money to actually shooting film. We talked a little bit about that at the start. And the fourth being better framing and exposure choices. Film simulations affect every part of the image, like contrast, dynamic range, color rendition, and saturation. So having the ability to shoot based on this look is really identical to shooting video to a LUT. All of these attributes can really make a huge effect on whether the image is interesting or not. Now, I can't emphasize this aspect enough because using a custom film simulation on a trip to Mexico this spring, it really allowed me to see the environment in a totally different way. The fifth being space saving. RAW eats up a whole lot of card space, and if you're traveling and you can't really unload a card, that card will go exponentially further with only JPEGs. For those like me with commitment issues, you can still shoot JPEG plus RAW and have the ability to work from your RAW if you're not happy with the simulation. This is one of the greatest things about Fujifilm and their simulations, which is that RAW allows you to change the simulation in camera. So if you shot, say, classic chrome, but you think that classic negative would have been a better choice, well, you can just re-export the same photo with classic negative or any other simulation. If you prefer a larger interface to do your RAW conversions, well, you can also do them on Fujifilm's X-RAW Studio software. On the X-H2S and likely all Fujifilm cameras going forward, you also have the choice of shooting 10-bit HEIF files, which give you much more latitude in post than JPEGs at comparable file sizes. Okay, so the balance of this video will be broken into three parts. First, the science of film simulations, as well as what we can and cannot accomplish in our quest for the filmic experience. The second part will be a breakdown of each built-in film simulation and its qualities. We're also going to dive really quite deep into the history of each film simulation and its corresponding film, as well as some technical knowledge on how the film itself works, so you have better context for what you're seeing. And finally, a way for you to create your own film simulations, emulating classic film stocks from multiple brands, or just to create your own look. In this way, Fujifilm really gives you more control than any other camera brand. Okay, so let's start now with the science of film simulations. I've never been a fan of scene or creative modes on camera. You know, the ones they offer like sepia tone or toy camera. They're super gimmicky, and I honestly don't really believe anyone uses them. You don't use them, do you? Do you? Film simulations or emulations are very different from creative modes. However, one important factor in this process is that you can't, in theory, ever perfectly simulate film stock. Now, the reason for this is controls. Even with the same film stock, let's imagine, say, multiple rolls of Portra 400, every film image can be different. The reason is development process being the biggest factor. Then it's the contrast and qualities of the lens that you used. Did you under or overexpose the image? And then finally, the subject you're actually shooting. So we can, at best, get in the zone or mood, but never an exact match because there's really no such fixed target that we can hit. As such, it's much easier to digitally match to a black and white stock than it is to a color one. There's one other potential barrier in getting digital to match film, and that is the color process. Digital technology is a display-based technology. Hence, it works off additive color, also known as RGB, while film is pigment-based, so subtractive color or CMYK in nature. Yes, when scanning the CMYK, it does get converted to RGB, but its base, the actual negative, will always be subtractive, and that's what dictates those colors. Each film stock made is also tweaked for color rendition and contrast, so there's really no hard and fast rule about what film looks like, save for halation or genuine film grain. But one anecdotal example is to really look at the 1966 Antonioni film, Blow Up. Look at the color of the trees and the grass. It's dark and bluish green. It's a color I'm always studying because it's not one that I inherently get with a digital camera. Digitally, regardless of camera, greens tend to be brighter and skew considerably more yellow. Now, this is rather a gross generalization, as some film stocks will also do this. I'm also going to own up to the fact that the color cast you're seeing may not have been actually native to the film itself. It could have been color timed to a print, or changed in the scanning of the film. Colors are also subject to fads, so what color stocks looked like in the 1960s could have changed drastically by the 1980s. Another great example is Hashem of the Pushing Film YouTube channel, who did a side-by-side comparison of the Fujifilm Pro Neg High simulation and their popular but now discontinued film stock Pro 400H. You can clearly see the effect I'm referring to.
The other thing you'll notice straight away is the grass and the shadows. On the film, they take on a much, so the shadows have a very blue look. You'll notice that throughout a lot of these shots, and the greens take on a very blue tint as well.
I'm going to mention the obvious here, is that yes, you can to some degree time this out in post by taking a slider, isolating colors, changing the hue, saturation, and luminance. But as I mentioned earlier, this is a lot of work. You can't save any of these changes as well in camera, and somehow it still doesn't feel organically the same to me because I'm only affecting one or certain colors, and film color science is really about how all the colors work in tandem. Subtractive saturation wants to lower the luminance where additive wants to bring it up. So film typically will have deeper, darker saturation, while digital will tend to blow out saturation. Maybe one day technology will advance in a way to solve for this and even add things like halation. But then it's really important to start off with the knowledge that we can get close, but never exact. Okay, so let's get into the simulations. First up is Fujichrome Pro Via, which is a professional color reversal, also known as slide film, with a superfine grain structure, vivid but faithful color reproduction, and a well-balanced gradation. It was actually my go-to film back in the early 2000s. It is the default on every Fujifilm camera because it strikes the comfortable middle in terms of saturation and tonality. One that Fujifilm themselves believe is their most versatile film simulation. But it wasn't, because it was slide film, their most versatile film. I'll say that. It's very middle of the road with some noteworthy points. Reds have a bit of a saturation bump, as do oranges, which also skew a little to the yellow. The dominant feature of this profile is the blue shift away from cyan to produce more realistic skies. It's best to think of Fujichrome Velvia as a boosted saturation and contrast version of Provia. This stock has always been a popular choice for flower-hungry nature photographers. Part of the psychology of imaging is that the brain doesn't remember images as they were in real life, because we actually imprint emotion with a slightly fading memory. So Fujifilm designed this film with the intention of representing scenes as photographers remember them. The brain also remembers red and orange far better than blue and green. Memory colors have always been a part of film engineering from the very beginning. Blues in Velvia skew a bit more to the magenta, for something more akin to, say, royal blue skies. Due to its intense saturation, you'll also want to avoid Velvia for portraiture. Another word of caution is that Velvia can sometimes push bright reds or magentas outside of sRGB color space, resulting in sometimes blown out details. Astia is another professional color reversal film with superfine grain. Contrast and saturation are closer to Velvia, but the skin tones are reined in, making it suitable for naturally lit portrait photography. The word soft in this simulation is misleading because it's quite high contrast and has very rapid highlight fall off. Soft here really just means subtle or low saturation skin tones, even more subtle than Provia. This also has an effect of reducing blemishes in lighter skin tones. Fujifilm recommends this profile for anyone using adapted vintage lenses with lower contrast. You can especially see how it's two profiles in one: soft, diffuse skin, and crunchy, saturated shadows. It's also a nice alternative choice to Velvia for nature when dealing with punchy reds or magentas. Classic chrome simulation is particularly meant for street and documentary photographers, mimicking the classic look of Kodachrome reversal film. Kodachrome was the slide film for journalists in the 1960s and 70s, as well as a very popular motion picture stock. While not emulating their own stock, they likely know a thing or two about how to get their competitor's stock in the pocket. Overall, it's a lower saturated simulation, where shadows have higher contrast, but the highlights still give somewhat of a softer look. Its standout feature beyond the desaturation is the handling of blues. Skies are now cyan cast compared to the more accurate blues of the previous profiles. Now, this is a great profile, arguably the best for street photography. It is also one of my favorite simulations because my preference is always towards less saturation. ProNeg Standard is emulating Fujifilm's professional studio portrait or wedding stock, which is the NS160 color negative emulsion. This is a contrast flexible film in the sense that the lower contrast allows the studio photographer to control the contrast with their lighting. So if you use this with natural light, that means you're likely going to end up with dull or flat images. What this profile does allow for is super smooth skin tone gradations and much more accurate skin color tonality. This simulation does half the work, while it's up to the photographer to sculpt the contrast with their lighting. While not explicitly spelled out, ProNeg High is meant to emulate the now discontinued 400H stock. Now, the whole point of ProNeg High is to give you the same tonality as standard, but with increased contrast and a shift in saturation. This is a much better profile when you have less control over lighting, like, say, naturally lit portraits out of the studio. While Astia is listed as the simulation for impromptu portraits, users may actually prefer ProNeg High for being more color accurate. Ultimately, it really just comes down to personal taste. For those who want another great Pro 400H option, Richie Roche of Fuji X Weekly has a very close simulation in which he uses classic negative and not ProNeg High as the base. We're going to talk about Fuji X Weekly a whole lot more in the third chapter of this video. Classic Neg is Fujifilm's simulation of their own consumer-oriented Superia 100. The profile produces very contrasty and slightly red-tinted images, giving a bit of a vintage feel, despite the fact that Superia 100 was only introduced in the late 1990s, so a relatively modern stock. But like classic film emulations, the greens are subdued and shifted to blue. The trees look a bit more like they do in those classic films of the 1960s, dark and bluish. Reds here, though, play a starring role, while most other colors are desaturated. It's a fun simulation to play with if you're into the whole "the photo has been stored in a shoebox for 40 years" kind of look. Inspired by the color prints from the 1970s New American Color Photography movement, and not an actual film stock, Nostalgic Negative isn't too far off from Classic Negative. But its tone is a bit warmer, and it shows a bit less contrast. As a result, the shadows benefit from more detail. Up to now, it has only been available on GFX cameras, and it is now also found in the new XH2 and the XH2S, leading me to believe that we're going to see it in future cameras. The term may not be familiar to Fujifilm photographers because it was a motion picture stock. As such, it was intended to give the cinematographer the maximum dynamic range and control. Despite this, before digital intermediate color grading, the film you shot was pretty close to the film you saw. In our modern world, we're used to working with raw or log images in video and just making it look how we want to in post. But there is a worthwhile skill to shooting and lighting to the limitations of your stock. And that is what Eterna gives you, a gorgeous video profile out of the box with plenty of latitude for small tweaks and grades. The color palette is similar to classic neg, but with a notably flatter curve. It's similar to what we now call a hypergamma, like Sony's S-Cinetone or Canon's YDR. With all hypergammas, they handle more underexposure than over. So the name of the game is exposing to protect the highlights when you can. I don't think this is something that will really appeal to photographers, but hey, maybe you want to give it a shot. It is important to note as well, though, that you can shoot video with all the profiles that we discussed today. Bleach bypass to me kind of borders on gimmick, especially for the cinematographer. This is a look that is reasonably achievable in post and hasn't really been used much since the 1990s. It was most famously used on films like Seven, Evita, Fight Club, and Saving Private Ryan. It's based on a lab development technique called bleach skip or bypass, which results in an image that looks like a contrasty black and white photo with a bit of color overlaid on it. There are some interesting things that you can do with it that do make sense for the photographer, or if you are, say, a student filmmaker and you want to make a grungy homage to 90s cinema, then bleached bypass? Bleached. Then bleach bypass may be for you. Let's now get into the black and white stocks. Acros is meant to simulate the popular Fujifilm Neopan Acros series of film stocks. Both the stock and the simulation are incredibly popular. The other important factor to consider, especially when it comes to black and white images, is film grain. I think we've all now seen what fake film grain looks like and how it often makes digital images feel strangely less organic. Largely because only the grain is there and not all the other filmic telltale signs. What makes grain simulation very difficult is two things. One is that silver halide crystals are all randomized on film. So real film grain will always have this randomized feel that absolutely affects the contrast of the image. Allow me to explain a little further. If the grains in an emulation are the same size, then the film tends to be high contrast. Additionally, the smaller the grains, the higher the contrast, but also the slower the film. Thus, it's actually difficult to make a fast, high contrast film or a slow, low contrast film. So to say that grain and contrast are symbiotic. The second factor is that film grain is a two-step process. It's not entirely determined by the base level or the size of your silver crystals. The development process expands the spread of silver and thus changes the properties of both the grain and contrast again. This is a concept we spoke about earlier, that when trying to match to a film stock, whether it's a gamma curve, color gamut, or grain, it's incredibly valuable to understand the whole process that gets us to our final image. Additionally, photographers would use colored filters in black and white photography to eliminate or control for certain colors, which affect the luminance rendition of parts of the image, notably, say, skies or skin tones. If this concept is new to you, the best way I can illustrate this is a clip from the 1937 film Shh, the Octopus. Yeah, it's called Shh, the Octopus. I know. Where the filmmakers used a tone of makeup that matched the color of the filter, thus eliminating those light rays from hitting the film. When we remove that filter, all colors are now hitting the film. When I take a landscape photo, for example, I can apply either no filter, a yellow, red, or green. Yellow will enhance the contrast and darken skies. Red does the same, but it'll take it a step further. And green generally improves skin tones in portraits. But you should really experiment to see what works best for you. Monochrome operates a little differently. It's simply just the Provia simulation with all the color removed. It has less contrast and grain compared to Acros. Now, this is less popular than Acros, but may be advantageous for studio or high contrast environments. It's a not very sexy name, but a still rather pleasant and resourceful profile. Fun fact, sepia was an actual printing process that helped preserve the aging of prints and was incredibly ubiquitous in the early portrait photography, which is why we associate it with portraits to this day. Now, I don't really understand why brands continue to add this to their picture profiles unless they see a big market for old-timey saloon photos in tourist hotspots. I implore you, the internet audience, to give me another reason to use this silly film simulation. We now turn our attention to the do-it-yourself segment of this program. Now that you know the power of Fujifilm simulations, you can harness that power for your own good or evil, if that's what you're into. The best gateway drug I can offer you is an incredible mobile app called the Fuji X Weekly app. This was an app created by American photographer Richie Roche and a colleague that creates really incredible film simulation recipes. There is a free and a subscription version. The free version is awesome and has no annoying ads or pop-ups. The subscription model does allow access for some great extended features like filtering by camera or sensor or by film simulation. You can also add recipes to a favorite folder for quick access. The subscription version also gives you advanced access to the newest simulations, and the app is available for both Apple and Android devices. I've included a link to Fuji X Weekly in the description below. Here's how it works. You choose a simulation that seems intriguing to you, or you can have a little bit of fun and play the random generator. Once you open up the simulation, you will see a detailed list of parameters. The best advice I have is to save a simulation to one of your camera's custom modes. First off, you'll either need to go into your menu or into your Q menu to change these parameters. You'll be changing things like white balance, shadows, base simulation, and the dynamic range, etc. Once they've all been matched to a recipe, the quickest way to save this to a custom mode is to hit the Q button and then a long press Q, which will bring you into the custom mode where you can also name your custom setting. Note that each simulation is designed with the appropriate sensor or camera in mind, so other sensors will produce slightly different results. You might think that Fujifilm has a look, but the color science from camera to camera can vary. So let's take a look at some photos I shot and edit them with XRAW Studio by hitting the random generator. Now let's talk about creating your own recipes. Before you create your own recipe, it's good to know what each parameter actually does. So let's go through those now. Film simulation. This is your base simulation that you'll build your properties from. As I mentioned earlier, it's as close to a real film simulation that you'll get out of any camera, so it's a great place to start. It is the dominant thing that maps all the colors and the contrast. Dynamic range. Fairly self-explanatory in terms of how much you want in the highlights. I haven't asked Fujifilm to clarify this, but I've noticed that all it really seems to do is restrict your ISO, because higher ISO values in all cameras equate to more dynamic range in the highlights. So it makes sense that it gives you more range because it just won't let you bury your ISO. Grain effect. I think this one is self-explanatory. Color chrome effect. This one deepens and darkens colors so that they retain their details even when they're very bright and saturated. Notably, red and green, and a little bit of yellow. Another fun fact. Do you have to do this every time? Yeah? Okay. Is that this effect is based on Fujifilm's experience with their limited run of Forza 50 slide film, which may have only really actually ever been released in Japan in concert with their Cherry Blossom Festival. As such, this is great for foliage or food. Color Chrome Blue. Color Chrome Blue does the same thing, but for the blue channel, so it's a natural application for retaining sky information. Highlights and shadows. This is going to allow you to change the shape of the gamma curve to preserve or eliminate detail as you see fit. Color, sharpness, and noise reduction should all be self-explanatory. One important note, which is about the clarity function. Reducing clarity is just as powerful as adding it. Reducing it is like adding sort of a soft effects filter to your camera. Skin tones are softer and more pleasing, and additionally, the softness definitely goes a long way in helping along that film look. There is one downside, however. This seems to require some heavy processing. So when you have this activated, there will be a processing delay. On the plus side, this could be a good excuse to slow down your photography, as it's nearly the same amount of time it would take for you to just wind your film camera one frame forward. However, I don't really like it. So when I shoot with a simulation, I have clarity off. If you want more or less clarity, then it's really simple. It's just something you can easily re-export with your photo after the fact. White balance shift can be adjusted to swing the hue and temperature around, particularly when some films skew more magenta or greenish. But exploiting the other settings, like using, say, the fluorescent white balance in an exterior environment, also produces interesting results. Okay, so let's talk about post-processing and make your own film simulation before we wrap this up. The example here is, say you like what the simulation gives you, but you want to dodge and burn, or change contrast, or colors a bit, so you need to be able to adjust this in a third-party program. The challenge I find with this is that when pulling the raw photo into either Capture One or Adobe Lightroom, the image looks different than the JPEG straight out of camera. Lightroom gets the contrast right, but the colors are wrong, where Capture One is mostly true to the colors, but the contrast isn't right. If I had to choose, I'd say stick with Capture One, as it's always easier to adjust contrast than color. My only other solution for this is to either edit the JPEG directly, which still has some surprising latitude if you're making small changes. Or for those who own GFX or XH model cameras, you can now export the image through XRAW Studio as a 16-bit TIFF file. This will retain the maximum amount of information and stay true to the original image. Let's turn to my best advice for making your own simulation. This is not the definitive guide on how to do it, but it is the method that works best for me. I'm sure you'll find other advice online that could complement mine. So, my method is a bit brutish, in that it's really just done by eye. It is an imperfect science. Because one thing that Fujifilm doesn't let us do in camera is adjust the phase of individual colors, as in when I say blue, what kind of blue, etc. All you can do is white balance shift, which shifts the entire image, not the specific color. For this reason and the reasons I mentioned earlier in the video, you'll never be able to match a film look exactly. You'll get it in the wheelhouse at best. Some might be close to a dead ringer, while others not even close. On the topic of the latter, let's look at an example. I shot this photograph on 35mm Kodak Color Plus 200. I likely overexposed it to stop, as I typically like to do. Then I took the same photo with the XH2S. Depth of field will be a little different considering the film is full frame and the XH2 is APS-C. I bring up the film photo on the screen, and then the Fujifilm shot in XRAW Studio. I start with choosing a film simulation that matches the contrast or the colors best. Colors are more important to match than to contrast because we have more control over contrast. I was flip-flopping between Pro-Neg High and Eterna, but settled on Eterna. Two things I need to tackle are the saturation and phase of the flower, as well as the color phase of the green leaves. Unfortunately, we cannot change the color phase individually, so you have to decide which colors are more important. Here I chose to match the flower. This means that I'll never be able to get the greens to match. If that's important to me, what I have to do is export the TIFF and take it into Capture One or Lightroom, make adjustments, and save those as a preset, which I would call a compensation preset. And that, my friends, is it for today. We went through a whole lot of info, but I hope the takeaway will empower Fujifilm users to start unlocking their creativity with either the built-in simulations or the ones which are found in the Fuji X Weekly app. As always, thank you for watching, and please subscribe to this channel for more videos like this and comment in the comment section below. I actually really love to hear what you have to say about doing film simulations either in the Fuji cameras or in other cameras, and what you've been able to do in camera versus doing in post, and some of the strategies that you have around that. I know that there's a lot to be said about this that I didn't cover, and I'd like to hear from your expertise, you, the audience. As always, for today, for now, for me, I'm out. Peace.